When was the book of Revelation written? Well, probably depends upon who you ask. Most study Bibles will have authorship and dating in the front of each book of the Bible. You will find by default, most of them will say probably somewhere around 94 to 96 AD. You say, well, it feels like everywhere I read and everywhere I look, this is what they say. I mean, this is the popular response to those who would claim that what Jesus prophesied would happen in 40 years did happen, and their response is that, well, it couldn't have happened that way because the book of Revelation is written much later, 24 to 26 years after the destruction of the temple. When you bring up to those who hold that there's going to be a third temple built, that the New Testament knows nothing of this, they will say, well, that's because the second temple was already destroyed. I thought, okay. So the response typically is this when you ask for evidence. Well, Irenaeus said. It's interesting because most people don't know who Irenaeus is or who he was, what he wrote. Most people have never read his writings. But we all become experts in the patristics as soon as someone says that the book of Revelation was written probably AD 68. Well, we've got to get rid of that, because if it was written before AD 70, then this entire enterprise of making millions of dollars will crumble. We're not just talking about a few million. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars will crumble in an instant. One famous pastor who writes almost exclusively on end times, to be rapture ready, that we are in the last days, as he approaches much later years in life, is still convinced that the end of the world will happen before he dies. His net worth is $50 million. You say, is it okay that he's worth $50 million? I don't have a problem with someone's net worth. My issue is that when your net worth is promoting something that is based primarily on presuppositions and a view of eschatology that was frankly introduced less than 200 years ago and is defended with a passion unlike anything else. We can erect golden calves. We can question the Trinity. We'll hear very little from fellow Christians. But the minute that you question the futurist interpretation of the book of Revelation, you quickly will be deemed a heretic, attacked from all sides and corners. But the interesting thing is that the, if you will, primary piece of evidence that is put forward, and I mean it when I say this. Now, they'll say there's other pieces of evidence like, well, that the persecution wasn't as widely active at that time, and other sorts of arguments that will crumble under their own weight when someone simply reviews primary sources and deals with historians of the first century. Now, if you only read popular commentaries by pastors who already hold these positions, you should expect to read the same thing over and over. But scholars will point out that all of this drives to one point, one reference, and it's Irenaeus. And it all hinges on one word. I kid you not. It all hinges on one word. And you will find the visceral fights that unfold. You'll see attacks on scholars who simply want us to look at the evidence. Not only will we look at Irenaeus, but in future lessons we'll look at Clement, the shepherd of Hermas, and other early documents. I believe that many of them, particularly Clement and the shepherd of Hermas, were written even themselves before AD 70. So as we look at this, our attention is drawn to a work by Irenaeus called Against Heresies. Now, I wouldn't expect any of you to have ever read it. I was forced to read it my first year of seminary. I was forced to read it, was confused by much of it during the first reading, and it took me years to develop an appreciation for really the first, if you will, systematic theologian in church history. Irenaeus, and his work is to be appreciated, it's valued. His work as a theologian is, I think, excellent in many ways, but his work as a historian raises a number of questions. And so he, in book 5, chapter 30, he's discussing an issue, and he's not discussing the date of the composition of the book of Revelation. He's actually discussing the reference in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation to the number of the beast, which is, in our translation, 666. There's questions that are raised early on because there are some manuscripts that have the number at 616. So he's dealing with this discussion concerning the identity of the beast. Now, one thing we do have in the book of Revelation is that John gives us, if you will, a time stamp. Now, the question is does that time stamp, how does it fit in what we know about church history? You find that time stamp in chapter 1 of the book of Revelation, verse 9. I, John, your brother and partner in tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. In future lessons, we will look at when was John on the island of Patmos. We will look at the evidence that we find from Tertullian. Also, we will look at evidence we find in the writings of other patristics, church fathers that is, such as Tertullian, Jerome, and we will look at Clement. But here we have a conversation on the so-called identity of the beast. Now, some have ascribed the beast to this Antichrist figure, but you should make note that the phrase, name, or title, Antichrist, does not appear in the book of Revelation. Now, you should find that interesting. Why should you find that interesting? Because there are only 2 books that we find that word, phrase, or title. It is in John's writings, in his letters. We find it in 1 John and 2 John. Now, you'd say, okay, well, why is it strange that it's there and not in Revelation? Because John is the same author. He penned the Gospel, the 3 letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the Apocalypse. And you say, what is Apocalypse? That's the original Greek word, and we translate that Revelation. So we hear Apocalypse, we think of like the movie Apocalypse Now or the end of the world. And the word meant to unveil or to reveal something. So there's conversations going on throughout church history about this identity of the Antichrist. Well, that comes up in Irenaeus' writings. Now keep in mind, this is important, Irenaeus is born probably about AD 130. He lives to approximately 200 AD. So he is removed from, if you will, let's say even the latest possible date of the writing of the book of Revelation, which let's say in 96, AD 96. So he's removed, his birth is removed approximately 35 years, and the time that he writes is even further removed. He is writing approximately, if you will, around the year 180. Now, that's interesting because now he's not just a generation removed from the alleged late date, but he's a century removed. He's a century removed. Not only that, he's the bishop in Lyon, which, if you recognize, we would say that's like southern France. So he's removed geographically. Now, his claim to fame is this. This is important. His claim to fame is this, that he had met Polycarp. You're like, this is another name. These names are crazy. Why do I need to know this? Because the minute that you begin to talk about a triumphal Christ who calls his church to be victorious, to advance the gospel, that the nations will be converted, the first retort is that the book of Revelation is future. We're living in the end times. It's being fulfilled right in front of us today. Don't you know the expertise commentary on the book of Revelation, aka the Left Behind series, breaks it all down for us and makes it simple. And so we need to go back and be able to respond as we find just your run-of-the-mill pastor out there saying, but Irenaeus said. Well, what did Irenaeus say? Well, he first of all says that he knew Polycarp. Well, who's Polycarp? Polycarp claims to have known the Apostle John. Now, that would be important. John being the author of the book of Revelation, you have access to a man who had access to the author. Well, I think that would boost his credentials. In many respects, we should expect that that would boost his credentials. I mean, that's as close as we can get, if you will, to somebody who can really connect some dots right back to the apostles. It's interesting, though, as he's writing almost a century later, he is not directly answering the question of the date of the composition of the book of Revelation. It appears that he's actually not addressing that at all. Now, for reference, Against Heresies has 5 books, and in the 3rd book, in chapter 3, verse 4, he claims that he had met Polycarp, who knew John. Now, the challenges that we face is this was originally composed in Greek. It's then translated into Latin, so that we have the Latin, but then we have a man by the name of Eusebius. And this is important because if we don't know church history, then we'll have someone coming along trying to convince us of all sorts of wild things and that we need to buy their books and enrich them while they continue to tell us that it's all over, to give up, to throw in the towel. Now, if we're throwing in the towels, I would expect them to throw their $50 million in with my towel, but that doesn't happen. And so Eusebius, the church historian, really the first church historian, writing in the 4th century, gives us Irenaeus' reference in Greek. However, he's still removed quite some time. If you have Irenaeus writing AD 180 and you have Eusebius writing into the 4th century, you can see there's some removal there. So we don't have, if you will, the autograph, the original writing that Irenaeus writes in his Against Heresies. So, with what we have, though, we can, if you will, I think comfortably state that we have his as close to his original writings as possible. Now, not having the original, we have these translations, and they do create some disruption. The passage in question on the alleged dating of the book of Revelation is part of a larger conversation. And that conversation is not preoccupied with when the book was written. It's preoccupied with who is 666 referring to. In fact, he says this. I'll just open where he opens. Such then, being the state of the case, as this number being found in all the most approved and ancient copies of the Apocalypse. Can we just pause there for just a moment? I want you to think about this. He's referring to ancient copies. Now, if you're referring to ancient copies, you certainly would not call something ancient if it's recently been written or has been written, if you will, late 1st century. Why would that be? Because we would expect that original copy is probably still in circulation. It would make sense. Many have suggested, I think rightfully so, in looking at the New Testament, that the autographs, the original documents that were written, were probably in circulation at the time when we get many of our manuscripts. So he's referring to the book of Revelation in book 5, chapter 30, verse 1. He's referring to these ancient copies of the book. So if the copies are ancient, what would we expect of the original? That it's novel, that it's contemporary. That's the complete reverse order. I mean, that makes absolutely zero sense. It's contradictory. So he starts off his assessment that there are copies. Now, he is in Lyon, and John writing in Ephesus. Now, it must be handwritten. You don't just get to download it and send it as an attachment to an email. You don't just get to go down to the bookstore and buy a copy for, it used to be 99 cents. Now I think it's $1.50 at the former dollar store. And you can get a copy of the Bible and you can read it. Can you imagine how long does it take before there are copies, plural, referred to as ancient when you're writing approximately AD 180? Would you call something that was written just 100 years ago ancient? And would you call it ancient if the copies, the autograph still was in circulation? No. So he gives us an idea here that the book has been in wide circulation, and those copies are considered an antique or antiquity. Now that's interesting, but we want to skip over that. We don't want to pay attention to the larger argument. And those men, now this is also important. We're not even in verse 3 where he allegedly mentions something about the date. He's referred to the ancient copies of the Apocalypse, or the book of Revelation. And those men who saw John face to face, bearing their testimony. His emphasis here is on personal contact. That's going to be important when we get to this so-called verse in question. Notice his emphasis. Saw John face to face. Now we're supposedly in 2 verses, he's going to completely switch from an anchor to his testimony. This is an anchor. He's anchoring his testimony in several things. First of all, that the ancient copies of the Apocalypse they're accessible. There isn't like there's one secret copy somewhere and only he knows where it is, and if you have the special secret knowledge, you could obtain an understanding. He's saying, no, these are copies that are widely circulated, and there are those who saw John face to face. That's important. Why is that important? Because John himself writes that way, does he not? When he writes in his letters talking about he'd come and talk to them, behold, see them face to face. So we know that's language that John would have used. Anyway, so it's an emphasis here, bearing their testimony, while reason also leads us to conclude that the number of the name of the beast, if reckoned according to the Greek mode of calculation, by the value of the letters contained in it, will amount to 666. That is, the number of tens shall be equal to that of the hundreds, and the number of the hundreds equal to that of the units, for that number which expresses the digit 6 being adhered to throughout, indicates the recapitulations of that apostasy taken in its full context, which occurred at the beginning, during the intermediate periods, and which shall take place at the end. He says, I do not know how it is that some have erred. Now we get into verse 2 here. So he's now challenging them. What is it that you've erred in your understanding? What is the problem? So when we get into the verse in question, which is verse 3, this conversation is continuing. Now as it continues, there's a phrase that I want to point out to you, and that phrase is, that was seen. That was seen. Now that's important, and here's why it's important. That is exactly how it's translated in the version that I have. That was seen. Now why is that important? Because for some, in some translations, it was seen, or is it a reference to he who was seen? I think that's important as we try to figure this out. Now, let me get right to the area so that we can understand what's happening here. He says, is this referring to that which was seen? Is this referring to the apocalypse? Or is this a reference to John? Which is it? What is the subject of the verb? Now, as we think about that, there's really simply 2 choices. He is referring to, and he's talking about, he says, at the end of Domitian's reign. So let me give it to you, okay? Here's what, right out of the text. For it was necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time. He's still talking about what? The identity of this individual who's been marked with a number 666. It would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen not very long time since, but almost in our day toward the end of Domitian's reign. That would be about 94, 96. So is it that John was seen toward the end of Domitian's reign, or that he received the apocalyptic vision? Now some, and I'm only going to touch on this, we can get into this later, some would say, well, Clement says that John returns from Patmos. He was on Patmos, chapter 1, verse 9. That John returns from Patmos after the tyrant died. This is what Clement says. Now some say, well, that's Domitian. He's clearly referring to him, but he's not. He actually doesn't refer to anyone. He just says the tyrant. But it's interesting because he gives us some things that John does after returning. And so think about this. If John is returning late 90s, 94 to 96, he's at least 80 years old, possibly into his 90s. And he's talking about that he's traveling all around and ordaining bishops and putting churches in order and handling things. And even a story that a young man was abandoning the faith and riding off on a horse, and that John pursued him on a horse. That doesn't sound like the activities of a 90-year-old man. Not now, especially not then. Would lead me to believe that Clement was referring to the tyrant as one who was universally known as a tyrant, not only by Christian writers, but by Roman writers and the world about. The tyrant was none other than Nero. His claim to fame is that he was one of the most wicked or evil Roman Caesars to ever have lived. So the question here is it that was seen, it was seen, or he who was seen? What's the subject of the verb? I think a strong translation could be this: him who saw the apocalypse was seen not very long since. Remember, he's already emphasized in verse 1 that there were those who had seen John face to face. This is something he's emphasizing. It would seem strange that he suddenly shifts to, by the way, the composition of the book was almost in our time. It doesn't support his argument, and actually it feels like it contradicts his argument. It contradicts the fact that he just said that they're ancient copies, but yet within 2 verses he's referring to the composition as nearly happening in our time. That's not how we would expect someone to formulate an argument. It seems to be contradictory. In fact, it would be, but your average Bible commentary isn't going to point that out. It simply jumps into verse 3 and says, well, it says it, therefore it is it can't be he. Well, there's a number of problems here. First of all, this isn't the original. And second, this is the translation. So, why do I think that it is stronger that it would be he? If you notice something in my translation here, is it starts off with the word for. In English, maybe that means nothing to us, but in the Greek, it is the word gar. We would translate it G-A-R, for. For, used in relation to him who was seen, makes the most sense in the way that the word in English for, but in gar in the Greek is used. It, referring to John, makes the text plain and straightforward. It's not disjointed. But to make it refer to the composition of the book of Revelation does great damage to the flow of the argument. In fact, it forces into the text something that is contrary. We would then expect, if you were doing an analysis of this text, like any other ancient text, we would then assume that there's an error in the writing, or a later scribe inserted something. Whenever you're reading a text, an ancient text, you will follow the flow of the logic and argument. And if there's an interruption that makes no sense, why it would interrupt that way, and doesn't follow the flow of the argument, you would assume that there's been some sort of transmission error, there was a scribal error, or something that used to be there is actually missing now. The most straightforward reading is this continued emphasis on personal contact. Personal contact in the 2nd century is essential to establishing one's credentials as a theologian and as a pastor. Why? Because you wanted to be part of the universal faith. You wanted to be part of the faith that was preached around the world. Those who saw John face to face? Well, we see this in ecclesiastical history, in Eusebius's writings, in both book 5, chapter 8, verses 5 and 6. Those who saw John face to face confirm it. Again, personal emphasis. Now, you might say, if Irenaeus is saying that this is much later, which I don't think that he's saying the book was written much later, you have Tertullian placing John's banishment after being dipped in oil, and Jerome says that was in Nero's reign. So you have two sources. You bring them together like a historian should. You bring their accounts together. They're not trying to complement one another. They're simply both providing different pieces to a puzzle. And then you would find that his banishment to Patmos is more likely in the reign of Nero. Of course, we must throw all this out. There's money to be made. There's notoriety to be had. And eschatology is the poor man's theology. Eschatology is the poor man's theology. You never have to be held accountable. You can walk around saying the wildest things, the most sensational things. And when you're wrong every single time, because you are wrong every single time, you always have the quick retort that continues to fill the coffers and give you credentials that you've not established or earned, and that is this: but we are one day closer. Let me ask you this, since we have this time reference that doesn't exist, that we're always moving towards. Have we ever stopped to analyze the way that we conceptualize time and recognize that the very fact that we're saying, but we're one day closer, is contrary to actually the way we think, the way we're organized, and the way the Scripture itself demonstrates history? For example, if I were to ask you how old you are, you don't say, well, I'm going to live to be 85 years old, therefore I have 22 years left to live. You know why? Because you don't know. The day of your death only exists in the knowledge of one who's timeless. Your point of reference is always this. If we're ever going to talk about we're one day something, you can only say we're one day farther away from the first day creation. You say, I'd never say anything like that. So when I ask you to give me a reference to who you are, and I would say how old you are, and that's a reference to what? The day of your birth. This is the very way that you live your life. Your time references are always to a past point of reference. Why? Because it's fixed. This idea that there's a fixed day in the future and that we're always just one more closer, I just missed it today. Can you imagine the psychological damage that it would do to my son if every morning during devotion I said, you know what? Today could be the day that I die, son. You be prepared that I may die. Here's the bank accounts, the weapons, the keys to the car. I may die today. We may die on the way to school, son. Be prepared, we may die. That's going to take a psychological toll that at some point that he's going to have to discount everything I'm saying and not take me serious on matters of substance. Why? Because I will have created this psychological, if you will, he would be paralyzed psychologically. There would be a paralysis. He wouldn't be able to concentrate and focus, and at some point, in order to get stable, he'd have to completely discount all I'm saying. But yet, we're off the hook. All we have to say is, but we're one day closer. And if that doesn't work, then we just simply point out that there's wars and rumors of wars. Okay, can I just go back to the garden? And since then, wars and rumors of wars. That's not conclusive. You say, Pastor, what else do you have for us? I'm not finished yet. The time reference. The when was John or it seen? Now, it's interesting because he writes book 3 in the year AD 175, really no later than AD 190. What follows that book 5 must be later. Book 5 is what we're talking about. So nearly 100 years since Domitian's murder, which was in AD 96, so this isn't simply a few years away. He's writing nearly 100 years later. In fact, almost 100 years later. In chapter 5, book 5, chapter 30, verse 1, he refers to these ancient copies. I've made reference to that. The book was in wide circulation even at a much earlier date. The autograph comes before these copies, and according to Irenaeus, these ancient copies all predated the end of Domitian's reign. Well, that's a problem. Well, not for me, but it's certainly a problem for you. It's not a problem for me because I don't have the composition of the book of Revelation at the end of the first century. I have it at approximately AD 68. It's not a problem for me. We refer to the ancient copies, and why would we, if the autograph is just merely penned in the year AD 96? I mean, this is just merely 34 years before he was born. I mean, think about it. For many of you, that would be, for our young people here today, the teenagers, that would be like you all referring to Fleetwood Mac as an ancient band. They're not, well, they are old, but they're not ancient. It may feel that way at times, but it was just merely, if you will, just maybe 30 years before you were born, maybe 40, I don't know. Why refer to these ancient copies if the autograph was just penned in AD 96? If these copies were made after AD 96, why call them ancient? That seems strange. Consider this also. Writing not a generation later, but a century later, some would even question Irenaeus' capacity as a historian. Eusebius believes that Irenaeus and others erred in their reliance on Papias, who, along with Polycarp in Irenaeus' world, were considered authorities. But it's interesting because there's a disagreement. The claim is that Papias heard the Apostle John. Irenaeus claims this. Book 5, chapter 33, verse 4. But yet Eusebius tells us that Papias would always say that if he could meet anybody who had heard one of the presbyters, and he's referring then to the apostles, speak, he would want to hear them or meet them and talk to these people who had heard them. Why would he be preoccupied with those who had met and heard the apostles if he himself had been one who had heard from John? We see already here two noteworthy figures in early church are at odds with one another. And of course, Eusebius also agrees that the Apostle Eusebius takes issue with the fact that John wrote the book of Revelation. He proposes someone else. He proposes a different John. And he's at odds here with Irenaeus. Of course, you've got other things, challenges with Irenaeus. He refers to the shepherd of Hermas as Scripture. That's certainly going to be a challenge to overcome. And then against heresies in Book 2, chapter 22, verse 5, he refers to Jesus as living into his 40s or 50s. That seems strange. What a reliable source. I mean, it's definitive. We only needed one word. That's it. One word. If the word is it doesn't matter what else he got wrong. It doesn't matter what else he wrote. It serves our purposes, and it establishes everything we need. Can you believe that this all hinges on one word? It doesn't for us. Not for my position. It doesn't all hinge on one word. We want the total evidence from the Scripture, the internal evidence from the book of Revelation, and we want all the external evidence, both from Christian writers and from non-Christian writers, so that we can try to faithfully pinpoint the date. I don't need the date to serve my purposes. I want to know the date so that I can accurately understand the book. Why? Because it matters. If it was written prior to 70 AD, then everything that Christ said would happen in this generation accurately was fulfilled. If not, you have to rewrite the Olivet Discourse. You have to then say that Jesus had an unrealized eschatology, and so did the apostles. You must remove every time stamp that we would find in the book of Revelation, especially when he keeps saying things like, this must soon take place, or these things must happen soon, or it's near. And when you point that out, here is the death nail to the argument. All you have to do is sit down and say, but the word church doesn't appear from chapters 4 through chapter 19 in the book of Revelation. Therefore, the church isn't there. Now you must read it the way I say. Well, then I would answer, that's a strange hermeneutic. I didn't know we employed that. But the interesting thing is when Paul writes to churches, he calls Christians saints. The word saint appears throughout those chapters. Furthermore, should we read the Bible that way? If so, then in the book of Esther, the name of God is not mentioned at all. Should we assume that God is dead during that era, or that he doesn't exist, or that they didn't believe in God? A very strange hermeneutic, to say the least. But it all goes back to this. You have to have Irenaeus supporting this late composition of the book, because then you need everything in the book being future. Then you can create this idea that you got to take everything in the book of Revelation literally until you can't take it literally. What's that mean? You say, no one teaches that, Pastor. That is exactly what's taught. I was taught that. I was taught to defend that. So you take everything literal till you can't take it literal. So how in the world do I take a book full of symbolism and symbols and analogies, and if you see references, no direct quotes per se, but a ton of references. There are certainly some quotes, but mostly references. What do you do with this? It's interesting that people who tell me to take it literally till you can't take it literally turn every symbol into something literal. An invention of their own. I was told that these great hornets or locust figures in the book were simply Apache helicopters if I just would take it literally. But it doesn't say Apache attack helicopter. Therefore, I'm not taking it literally. So we're accused of trying to make the book spiritual or symbolism and not taking it literally. But what I would argue is if it says it soon should take place, or this is happening now, you're the one not taking it literally. So let's do this. Let's just start in the very first verse and let's just take it literal till we can't. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. I can't take that literal. Well, I can't read any farther. I mean, I've just employed the very hermeneutic that you say is definitive in interpreting the book of Revelation. He didn't mean soon. It meant when the future, when this happens, it'll be soon. So why didn't he just say to that audience, hey, by the way, this isn't for you. Keep a copy of it. Debate it for 2,000 years. Make a lot of copies of it. Hand it out. Read it. Because he says, read. It should be read. It should be heard in the church actively. Why wouldn't we have a footnote, a disclaimer, something in the opening, maybe even something in the close? John, please help us. That would say, this has no real relevance to you or application to you. Someone would say, well, the 7 churches, well, okay, those churches don't exist anymore, and so was it just to those 7 churches? If we apply that same rule, then you shouldn't be reading Ephesians, Galatians, you shouldn't read Colossians, Philippians, Thessalonians. Eusebius believes that Irenaeus and others erred in their reliance on Papias. Irenaeus considered the Shepherd of Hermas canonical. Irenaeus believed that the Septuagint was inspired. That is, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. He believed that the translation was inspired. Irenaeus and Polycarp, Irenaeus says he learned from Polycarp, who allegedly saw John face to face, but it's interesting when you take in consideration what Irenaeus actually says about knowing Polycarp. He says when he was a child, in the first age of his life, he met Polycarp, and then he admits he took no notes on the meeting. So let's just assume, let's just try to be fair to him, the first age of life, let's say, so he's born in AD 130, let's say that he's 15 years old, 145. Okay, and he meets him, takes no notes, but then at the year 180, he's going to begin to recount these things to us with accuracy. No, I don't agree. That seems far-fetched. I can't tell you what I had for breakfast yesterday, and I can't remember the contents of our last conversation. I'm pretty sure I'm going to struggle with something I didn't write down that took place 40, 50 years ago. The other thing is, and I don't mean this to be mean-spirited, I actually hold Irenaeus in high regard, and I have a great appreciation for his work. I don't have appreciation for those who've hijacked his work and abuse it. My appreciation for Irenaeus is significant. I'm grateful for his writings. They were difficult when I first read them, as I considered the fact that he was dismantling Gnosticism and other heretical views that had surfaced, and was a brilliant man. I also recognize he was a flawed man, like all of us. Irenaeus' reason that we have 4 Gospels is because there are 4 winds. It's interesting, those who would go and argue that he is definitive on the age of the composition, the date of the composition of the book of Revelation, don't acknowledge that we would never, who amongst us tonight would seriously argue that there are only 4 Gospels because there are only 4 winds? That's not a serious argument. We shouldn't take that argument serious. Yet, we say it's definitive. One word that breaks the flow, that doesn't fit the syntax. That's why in my translation, I won't even use the word it. It says for that. It tries to take the middle of the road, in a sense. It doesn't know what to do. When in fact, the flow is focused on seeing John face to face. It's recorded that John did live many, many years, maybe even into that reign. Later he says that John lived into Trajan's reign. But which was it? Irenaeus? He seems as if he's all over the place. But the minute that you take a position against the sensationalism that has predominated Christianity for the past 50 or 60 years, this is supposedly the death knell, as if I never read Irenaeus. So what do? I think we go with the flow of the argument, with the natural reading of the text. Him who saw the apocalypse. He's focused on personal connection. It would make the most sense that he says that this personal connection was this person, that is John, was alive even up into almost our time. That makes sense in the context. Suddenly interrupting and focusing on the composition of the book, the date of the composition of the book, makes no sense, especially since he's already referred to these ancient copies, and it doesn't support or strengthen his argument in any way, shape, or form, because he's not even arguing about the date of the book of Revelation. He's arguing about why the identity of this person wasn't revealed, and to understand it was only known to the author. Some have beheld him face to face, some knew him, and even knew him up into nearly our present time. That is what makes the most sense. However, presuppositions seem to drive people to conclusions that are already predetermined. And so if your system is one that is hinged upon the fact that we must be living in the end times, that we must disconnect from all objectives, all organizations and entities that would carry us forward and propel the gospel to convert the nations, well, then certainly you're going to defer to a misreading of Irenaeus. It wasn't long ago, my wife and I had this conversation last night. It wasn't long ago. In fact, it was just a couple of years ago. I was at a meeting in an organization. I admire what they're doing. I appreciate their efforts, and I support the initiatives. But I remember speaker after speaker getting up, and it was as if they needed to say the, if you will, the cultic language to fit in. You know, every group has certain words that we have to say to be part of the group. And I remember felt like speaker after speaker saying, we're the last generation. This is it. The end will be here soon. But I want to be found faithful, trying to change the world, so that when Christ comes back, he finds me trying to change the world and make it a better place. And I just kept thinking to myself, you actually don't believe that. See, functional theology is what you really believe. You can confess all day long something, but way that you're functioning is what you really believe. And I left that place that day realizing that functionally most of the people in the room were post-millennial. But because you didn't want to lose your job, credentials, or friends, you had to say things like, this is the end times, this is the last days. It's over, folks. It's almost done. But yet we should spend millions of dollars trying to fight back and push back against evil. Functionally, they all believe and agree. But the problem is the minute you don't use the language of the group, you will be alienated. You will be separated from the group. That's why we have to say things like, but we're one day closer, because we don't want the group to think we're outside, that we are not part of the group. We have to say things like, we're living in the end times, because we want to fit in with orthodoxy. We think that's orthodoxy. It's not orthodoxy. So let me say this. How should you live if today was the last day? You should live as if today wasn't the last day. You should live as if there's going to be 1,000 more generations. You should be preoccupied on raising successive generations to know, love, and serve the Lord Jesus Christ. And stop being captured by and captivated by the sensational claims that are always 100% wrong. You say, that goes too far. I'm telling you this. The one thing I can say for sure about eschatology, the one thing I can say that is 100% true, is that every single prediction is always wrong. Now, the Bible's always right, but every prediction that we're closer, that it's going to be in 3 years or 5 years. And I had a man sit me down and told me that Christ was returning in 2028. It's almost 2026. He conveniently told me back in 2020 that I should not worry because that meant that the rapture would happen in 2021. According to his own prediction, he and I have been left behind, and we are doomed because apparently the Antichrist has already signed the covenant, and it's just a matter of time before God kills 2/3 of us before this Advent in 2028. Seems strange? Don't worry, there's more predictions to come. But they're always 100% wrong. Let us pray.